Okay, do you see full screen now?
Yep, perfect.
Do you get the really bad Dungeons and Dragons joke?
No,
Oh, you dated
I
in high
don't.
school, Sonia. Okay.
But
Surely there's nerds on here who get this. I myself am a warrior nerd, proud of it. Um, and I actually, looking at my screens right now, I realize that I'm actually probably chaotic good. But this is a pun on alignment for those of
I
you who
get
don't
it.
know.
I get it
Okay,
now. I get
got
it.
it. All right, cool. We're also going to unpack this term, the human domain. Sony may have warned you that I'm given to terrible neologisms, I'm supposed to make words up, but I find it can sometimes be pretty useful. Let me start with after many years in the government, the disclaimer. Okay, views, opinions expressed this talk are solely mine, insofar as anyone who's paid any attention to social science still believes that any of us really somehow are solely responsible for the views and opinions we hold. If you think you're the only reason why you hold your opinions, we got to talk. That said, I am also not a philosopher, right? So there's going to be some discussions today about pseudo philosophy. I never wanted to be, never asked to be. So I will offer probably pretty like flaky philosophical observations, and will not take it personally if you find me to be about as profound as a fortune cookie. For example, I predict you will soon see more slides. All right, so that's it. Regardless, they don't reflect those of the USG, USC, Sonia, Quad, any other carbon-based or digital form of life or agents. I can't believe I had to update this disclaimer so soon. Thanks a lot, OpenAI. And these opinions are likely to change if and when I am presented with stronger evidence, which I'm proud of, but sometimes means like, well, you didn't used to think that. Reminder, where you sit is where I stand. So there is tragically, as Sony said, a reason why I have 3 cell phones. And that's why I'm as tired as I really am as tired as I look. I started at Oxford. My field work in anthropology really was largely just like rugby. Don't tell anybody, but I wrote a PhD. Then I ended up as a program manager for what's called IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. I am not tracking chat, by the way. So if anybody's sending like emojis or stuff, I'm going to need somebody to interpret that for me. Did IARPA for 6 years, studying things like trust and trustworthiness, cognition enhancement. I moved to DARPA, which is where I was there for 5.5 years, and that's actually where I really got to know Sonia. In fact, I funded much of her work because she is one of these unicorns who does AI and social science. Then I went to University of Maryland, as you mentioned. Then I helped stand up ARPA-H. If you think I have an ARPA fetish, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? So what I serve to help stand this thing up because I'm a big believer in the ARPA model of high risk, high payoff research. I'm currently at USC and also part-time at NIST. I'm not speaking for either of those things today, just to be clear. This is just all me. So DARPA anthropologist walks into a joke. For those of you who have PowerPoint bingo, you may check off the obligatory far side at this point. But I actually put this up somewhat seriously because as far as I can tell, was the first anthropologist program manager. I think that's true. Maybe the last as well until we get Sonia to go to DARPA. But this is sort of the general response you get from people who work in the natural sciences. Like, hey. If you want to torture yourself further, you can listen to a podcast from an anthropologist from DARPA. And people ask, like, what was it like to be in a big building filled with like natural scientists and physicists? And I can tell you it was exactly like this. Physicists would come over, they would ask us questions, and then couldn't understand, like, why do you need a whole journal for your field anyway? Can't you just model humans as like a simple system and add some variables I just made up? No, thank you very much, physicists. And here's why. Because the human domain we work in, right, not just cyber, physical, air, sea, land, has these properties and these problems. Mainly you. You are the problem of the human domain because you are the elements that are strategic. We're always playing games. We're always doing the I know, you know, that I know, that you know, I know. We have collective fictions or these effects that become causes. We make stuff up. Like DARPA is not a real place. It's just something we kind of agree to. So we have these effects and they didn't become causes. Games can be altered. Think about all the different sort of social identities that are being reinvented and reimagined all the time. Used to be you couldn't get married if you were gay. Now you can. Games can be changed. And then, unlike other natural systems, motivations change and they matter, right? Why people are doing things actually matters. It's not just that they're doing X. Don't take my word for it, though. If you're a physicist, you know who you are. You can listen to Murray Gell-Mann, Nobel Prize winning physicist, who pointed out how much harder physics would be if electrons could think, to which then Richard Feynman said, imagine how much harder physics would be if electrons had feelings. So congratulations, you all are in the human domain and working with thinking, feeling electrons. But wait, it's worse. Because now we're in the human domain, right? Because what we're looking at is not just the thinking, feeling electrons, but the intersection of thinking, feeling electrons that are now working with technology, software, being connected in new ways, in a very real way, co-evolving with this kind of new technology, as you're aware. But that has implications, because that leads to what we call socio-technical complexity. It means you cannot just study the social, and you cannot just study the technical. You have to see the complexity that emerges between this. And this means, again, I promise it won't all be bad news. You can't reasonably use simplifying assumptions that most current theories or tools require, right? You cannot actually work with a spherical cow. You have to take into account variance, complexity, et cetera. You can't reasonably model the world as mechanistic, timeless, and universal. A pre-iPhone and post-iPhone world are different worlds. They are not timeless, universal. Same thing with like pre and post, GPT. And we can't reasonably aggregate humans, groups, or systems into single representative agents. Nothing will drive me quite as crazy as someone talking about the human. Tell me who this human is, and tell me why I should believe anything else you say that follows. Like, well, I'll tell you about the human, unless you can actually produce the human you're talking about. In which case, I will listen to you. If you're talking about generally the human, I don't buy it. So here's some pseudonymous laws I'm going to offer you. Towards the end, I'm going to offer you your sort of law book, as it were, the human domain. My second law, named after me, I don't even think it's actually a law, but is that because of this, context is almost everything, and the human domain, almost everything is context. Yay. So into this mix, we have the aliens. And what do I mean by aliens? I actually don't use the term artificial intelligence when I talk about AI. I call it alien intelligence. And the reason I do that is because if you can see on these rapidly, I'll say borrowed pictures. I'm not going to say I stole these, right? I'm not OpenAI, but these borrowed pictures, you can see like AI is not a thing. There are many different instantiations of it and what it can be done and how it can be used. And I actually think of this almost as like a tree of life. There are different kinds of aliens among us. And I would justify that by pointing out that some of these AIs actually work kind of like squirrels. They're very pattern prediction. They're forecasting like what's going to happen next, and so probably so like other than are much more sort of like octopi or octopuses, right? They're much more sort of problem solving. They're generative in some sense. Either way, and any way you look at it, they're all getting sort of better, right? I'm sure you've seen this chart. I don't believe in benchmarks to let you know, but either way, one can't look at that and not be sort of impressed, if not a little scared, because there are different kinds of intelligences in the world. The notion that that an alien intelligence has to look like ours is just completely wrong. Again, other forms of life evolved intelligence defined as ways to solve problems in their ecosystem, and they've done it very differently, like phylogenetically very differently. So the idea that anything has to evolve intelligence the way we have, I think is misleading. Nonetheless, these intelligences are doing fun things like reward hacking. If you don't know what that is, that basically is I'm asking it to solve a problem or to complete find a solution, and it does so, but not the way I meant it to. So everybody's sort of familiar with like the reward hacking AI and the video games. It realizes the way to win Pong is just get the ball stuck in one corner and go back and back and back and back. It's not actually playing the game. It just has figured out like I can get more points. Or if my speedboat goes in a circle, get in again, I can, I will ultimately produce more points. But that's not really what I meant, you stupid alien. I meant solve this game problem. There's model leakage. These things just sort of leak stuff. There's problems of deception increasingly. Now, I don't mean here like it's playing that game of I know that you know that I know, but there's indications that it's, especially the O1, for example, that it knows what it's supposed to say and doesn't necessarily like come to that conclusion or say that thing it's supposed to do. All these, by the way, are deeply controversial, so I don't want to say it's a solved problem. Malicious uplift. We're worried about what the AI can do, but we should also be worried about what AI can let us do, right? Can I take an undergrad biologist and turn them into bioweapons grade scientist? Can I turn an ordinary lab or what would have been or disorganized sort of terrorist effort into something that really can produce nation state level bioweapons, for example? Not yet. But there's no logical reason why we couldn't be headed that way. There's toxicity, which we're all familiar with, right? This is not just bias, but it's also, poisoning, frankly, the information environment. There are people who've actually literally stopped training their models on certain forms of data because it's poisoned by other synthetic content. AI is producing material that's being sucked up into other AI and kind of ruining the whole thing. Agents gone wild. If you're not familiar with agents, that's like the next step where they're instantiating semi-capable sort of AIs that can be given a goal and off they go. And terrifyingly, we're going to let them out onto the internet to let them go do this stuff. Everybody always uses the example of they're going to book travel for you, but I can tell you they're going to do a whole lot of other things in this space. So more even there. All right, so the aliens are among us. And I do think it's worth thinking about aliens because I when I was at DARPA, I worked with canine units, and you talk to people who work with dogs, and they like the amazing thing they can do with dogs, but they would never let the dog drive, right? They know the dog doesn't know how to do that, but even among dogs, they understand that different dogs have different features and capabilities. So it's like they're dealing with these aliens. They just know how to use them. Let's talk about values very quickly. What are our values? Discuss amongst yourselves. I'm kidding. And then a bigger question from my perspective is nothing makes sense except in the context of evolution. What the hell are values for anyway? I mean, we have them, we think, but why do we have them? So I'm not going to go into detail about here, but many people have spent much time trying to define both individual values. So what you see there's the Schwartz Value Index. You see Geert Hofstede talking about cultural dimensions. There are people talking about, like, in this case, Dutchness around the world based on values. They're carving the world up into different kinds of values based on things like self versus other oriented. At the bottom, again, poorly stolen from recent, well, not recent, study that I know the author, Scott Atran, looking at things called sacred values versus instrumental values. So not only do we have values, but we have values that look like they're very different. What they're trying to argue there is when you're dealing with a sacred value, you will not accept any amount of money to change your opinion. But if you're dealing with an instrumental value, I can buy you off. I don't want to say this is a solved problem either. But why do we have these things? Well, the first obvious one is, frankly, coordination. And here I think back to evolution in the sense that a group that evolves values, we'll talk about how that works. The group that evolves values will outcompete a group that does not, right? If I have some sense that you and I share like a moral sense or code of what's right, that enables a capability now for us to trust, for us to build an identity, for us to do things that we can't do on our own. If my group does not evolve that capability, we will be outcompeted. The other, though, is similar, is this idea of social learning. Again, one of the great crimes, I think, or early crimes of artificial intelligence is they look at intelligence as the thing that happens between your ears. And if you get a chance to read this book, Secret of Our Success by Joe Henrich, they make a very compelling argument that our brain, while being sort of an engineering masterpiece, is actually really unimpressive on its own. We're given to bias. We actually don't have great working memory. As an individual, we're not actually that fantastic. We tend to think we are because we have access to things like the internet. And that's actually called the illusion of explanatory depth. If someone in your network knows something, you think you know it too, even though it tends not to be true. If you put me and a chimp on a desert island in 2 weeks, who do you think is still going to be there? It's not me, right? It's the chimp. But what I can do that the chimp can't is I can learn from unrelated people, right? I can use social learning. And the value of that is I can look and see who's doing well in my culture and adopt strategies. And invariably, values have some role in highlighting who are good people to learn from, and then also like what I should learn. So I think values are, but anyway, this is me putting it in the context for y'all in that regard. Let's talk about alignment, which is I think what we're here for. What does it actually even mean to be aligned? Here's my fortune cookie philosophy. These are actually terms that are used to describe AI alignment, that an AI reliably acts in a way that humans would consider beneficial and ethical. How is that different from how we're aligned? And it's not obvious to me if they are actually all that different. The key being here, though, that it's about acting in a way that humans, not the human, but awfully close, would consider beneficial and ethical. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more and say, is there anything that every human would say, oh yeah, that was beneficial and ethical? Because if there isn't, we might have a challenge when it comes to AI alignment. Let's start first from the model perspective, though. So where should alignment happen? We're starting to talk about the goal of having an AI behave in a way that is aligned with our values. So back to this example of reward hacking, if my value is I need you to solve this problem, I need you to do it in a way that doesn't hurt other people or doesn't like break the rules, then a model or an AI that does that can be said to be aligned. with my values. Where the hell is that supposed to happen? And there's open debates right now, technically, on how to do this. So you have things like constitutional alignment, where what the goal there is to get in sort of early to the model. So you're looking to actually build in essentially principles or derive values from your community and bake that into the model if you can. The more famous one you guys are probably familiar with is this inverse reinforcement learning, also known as reinforcement learning with human feedback. So a model produces something and says, nuns or Nazis. And you're like, well, I gotta go nuns. And so it learns from that. It's like, okay, so nuns or stormtroopers. Well, I'll go nuns. And so because humans are getting feedback, the model begins to become sort of more aligned, quote unquote, with those humans at least who are providing feedback. There's efforts to do debate, so you can actually have multiple models sort of debating each other, and that's the notion of sort of bootstrapping for alignment. And then this idea of amplification is, rather than trying to build a model on principles, you're taking tasks you want the model to do and decomposing it into smaller tasks, and then essentially getting human feedback on those individual pieces of the tasks. So yes, you did this in accordance with my ethics or whatever. You did this piece, and if I put it together, the supposition is I have an aligned process or model or outcome. There are, still a lot of work being done in this space, but there's even earlier efforts of people, because I think most people quite appropriately are realizing like that's not going to solve the entire problem. So some of the other stuff that's being tinkered with is one that's called pro-social priming, which is how do you get pro-social data and pack it into the data sets. So as you train these things, it's like they're just being exposed to pro-social behavior to begin with. I think that's really interesting as a concept, because notionally with a lot of data, you can actually get lots of examples of different kinds of behaviors that might still fall under like beneficial or ethical. Still yet to be done. Recursive reward modeling speaks to like reinforcement learning with human feedback, but the model's actually teaching the human how to give better feedback too. So it's recursive, right? Which I think is also interesting. There's a whole lot of hope on interpretability. Like if I can just figure out what the model, like why the model is doing what it's doing, that will allow me first to know, better sense of how it made its decision, but also then to better understand, was it in fact an ethical decision? None of this stuff is simple, by the way. And then there's a big push on this AI governance frameworks. So once the model has been produced, how do we sort of capture what it's doing, interpret it in the framework, and then give feedback so we can sort of change the model or update or improve on that. And again, lots of interesting stuff there. My personal opinion, not enough money being spent in this area. I think we're doing a whole lot of work on the engineering, and when it comes to actually doing this sort of stuff, hopefully it'll start picking up. Well, so that leads to the question of like, well, how does alignment happen in us, right? I mean, we end up being pseudo-aligned, at least. We started from this notion of coordination and social learning. How does that occur? So there's these arguments of like, there's this moral development that occurs in humans. I don't want to get into this discussion because I actually don't know the answer. Like going from, and I have two children, 7 and 4, noticeably at different stages. The 4-year-old is a sort of evil genius and has already figured out like, I know what you want me to say, and I'm going to say that, but I totally did what I wasn't supposed to do. The 7-year-old just like will turn herself in and everybody else. It's fascinating as they move to this sort of law and order morality. The bigger question though is like, why? I mean, yeah, they're making this change developmentally, but why? Like, what's causing that change? Is it just like neurobiology? I refuse to believe that. It's just that wouldn't make any sense. But we also don't know exactly what is the feedback they're getting that's driving this direction. Is it true? Is true alignment even possible? Let's talk about the possibility that it won't be. One is the value complexity, right? Humans have really intricate values. They're context-dependent and oftentimes contradictory. Do no harm in the military. If you're a doctor in the military, you have do no harm. That can oftentimes be at odds with protect your brother or your sister, right? Make sure they come home. It's do no harm for some people, but not for everybody. There's also value diversity, which we've already seen. You can carve the world up into different kinds of values based on what's sort of premised. There's orthogonality thesis, which is the idea that we can build exceedingly intelligent systems that actually don't really have to align with us at all. They can behave the way we think they should, but they might have very different goals in some sense. Here is an example where, from a biological perspective, we have sex to reproduce. It pays evolutionarily for sex to feel good, but humans have hacked that, right? We have birth control. We have other processes by which we can have sex without reproducing. That's an argument from an orthogonality thesis is we think there's a clear goal in alignment, but there's ways to get around that. And then there's this ontological mismatch, which is they may just see the world in different ways. And I use the term anthropomorphically, but they may just see the world in different ways. So the notion that they're going to have values or be aligned with our values is just, just a pipe dream. There are people who argue against this, right? So approximation sufficiently. It won't be perfect, but like with humans, it could be good enough, right? That we have enough like distribution, around the mean, the standard deviation, like that behavior wavers, but it's still within the like don't kill all humans kind of thing, and that could be all right. Evolutionary precedent suggests that we actually have evolved to have broadly aligned values. So we're back to this sort of pseudo argument of can we evolve these things to be similar along our lines? There's this ongoing progress I talked about earlier, research on people exploring in this area on how to do this. Stuart Russell has this really interesting idea of provably beneficial AI, which is you never want to make an AI that knows what it's doing. And by that, I mean, it's constantly uncertain. It constantly checks back in with humans to say, like, is this right? Am I doing this right? Is this good? Because that degree of uncertainty will prevent it from necessarily being unaligned because it's going to keep coming back to us. So it says like, yeah, is this good? I boiled the cat. You get a chance to say like, no, that's not, I don't want you to boil the cat. And then this is the least compelling to me, this meta level alignment is the idea of like, we can actually meta level align somehow. I think it's just kicking the can down the road. I think it's actually not answering their question, just sort of putting it in a different framework. Can't the social sciences save us? Sonia, that's surely you're growing a new generation of social scientists who help us.
Yes.
Yes, they can, except for one problem, at least historically, is the large majority of people that we have studied look kind of like me. They tend to be weird subjects, Western educated, industrialized, rich Democrat. And you can see here, well, this is back in 2008, things might have gotten a little bit better, but 96% of the subjects being studied in things like psychology and moral studies largely came from these Western countries, to the point that someone actually suggested the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology should actually be called the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology of American undergraduate psychology students. That would be more accurate as to what they're presenting. But the way we write these articles, we make it sound like they're universal. The other challenge is we actually don't have strong theories about all this stuff. We have lots of theories, but they sometimes are incoherent and contradictory. And so trying to put it together in a way that gives us a theoretical approach to understand what theoretically AI should be doing or how to align them is pretty weak at the moment. And this is just, I mean, we think this is sort of obvious, but way back in 2009, there were some radicalists who thought, well, you know what? We have these behavioral economic games. You may have done some of these yourself. There's like the ultimatum game or the dictator game or the trust game. And here's an example of the ultimatum game is I have $10, you're my partner, and I have to offer you a certain amount of money. And if you take that amount, we both go home with our money, right? So in theory, I have $10. If I offer you $1, rationally, what should you do? Take it, right? That's $1 you didn't have. The reality is most Western subjects will be like, screw you. I'm rejecting that. And I'd rather punish both of us. So I usually have to get up to like $4 or $5 before you start getting people who accept that. That's what this idea of punishment of free riding comes to do. But what they've discovered is when they took these games outside of essentially the Western culture, they saw really different behavior that on the face of it looks completely like irrational. In this case, people are literally paying more money to punish free riders than they would actually just lose normally. And there's arguments about like, well, what's going on there? Some arguments are like, in some cases, I don't want you to give me a lot of money because I'm in your debt, right? And so for me to think otherwise, I have to imagine this world in which you and I will never engage again. And most people don't see the world that way. The idea of a one-shot economic exchange is just kind of ludicrous. Anyway, I could go on, but the whole point being like, even the basic behavior we thought we understood about people seems to be pretty variant. And that is probably a function of the different values in place. All right, so where to now? Oh, I'm sorry, you want me to answer that? I thought some, okay. I don't know, is the answer, but here's what I'm proposing, or this is how I think about it anyway. And I'm sure Sonia can deconstruct this for me, but it does seem to me that where I sit as an anthropologist, sort of on the right, the fuzzy stuff of the human domain, and then the sort of AI work, computer science, like the hard quantitative sort of stuff on the left. has evolved as sort of two cultures. There's a very famous book, C.P. Snow. Now, he was originally talking about the humanities and the natural sciences, but his point was like there really are these two different cultures. They think very differently, and I think to some degree that's true if you're talking to someone other than Sonia. I think Sonia walks this really interesting line, and here's why. I think they differ, the quantitative and the qualitative, in terms of how they think about the role of context, what tools they use to get after there, the role of meaning, what are the goals of both of the sciences, but also the people that are studying the sciences. What's the role of prediction? And then ultimately, like, what is the value of uncertainty in this case? So let me start with the quantitative quickly and say, from the quantitative side, when you do computational social science for the most part, when you're ingesting tons of information and trying to pick up on patterns, really what you're trying to get is facts about social interactions. There's social interactions occurring. I'm capturing that data, and I just want facts about like when are people doing something? And that refers to what's called the EDIC method. EDIC is a term in anthropology meaning you're on the outside looking in. So there's an objective scientific stance that's called EDIC. The goal is to find the meaning in the data, and you're looking to identify patterns. And in this case, prediction really is kind of like description. I won't die on that hill, but my point being that even with like large language models, when they're making predictions about the next token, they're in fact sort of describing an underlying logic of sorts. And then uncertainty, for the most part, in the quantitative world, is a bug. You don't want that uncertainty. It's problematic. Let's go to the qualitative side, where I live my other half of the brain life, right? In this case, facts actually arise from social interactions. They're not these things that exist in the world. They are something that, by virtue of interacting, we create these things. In fact, in many cases, we come to agree on what a fact is. And studying that requires what's called EMIC methods from an anthropological. So I have to get in and take the native's point of view, right? And in anthropology, we use like participant observation, go live with people, kind of live their lives along with them. But really what you're doing is you're taking the world on their terms. You need both EDIC and EMIC, but there's an underappreciated value of EMIC methods. And so rather than just finding meaning in the data, we're looking for what do people think is meaningful data, right? If I don't actually think it's meaningful, I'm not going to change my behavior around it. So it almost isn't that meaningful in some sense. We're looking for constructs, not just patterns. Like what are, again, symbolism. Values are constructs. They're not just patterns. Prediction, in this case, makes us nervous because it's about prescription. If I predict how a system's going to behave, I'm actually making a value judgment in some sort. And we can unpack that later. But in the qualitative world, uncertainty is kind of a feature. Go back to this notion of like social learning we started with, right? Uncertainty is a source of creativity. Uncertainty is a source of reinterpretation. Uncertainty is a source of agency, because in the presence of uncertainty, there's options for me to do things, right? Sometimes confusion, sometimes noise can give rise to like really interesting things. It also forces me to be social. Think back to the behavioral economics game. If I don't know what you're going to do in the future, I treat you very differently than if I assume you're just a one-shot person. I don't care. Qualitative, neologism, make it a thing, y'all. Get on social media or whatever you kids do nowadays. The notion of qualitative is you need to marry the both, right? We need the quantitative, certainly at the scale that's possible. We also understand qualitative. We need to get into people's heads to some degree and their social lives. We need to think in terms not of rules or facts, but social heuristics. We're making stuff up as we go along. We need reflexivity to this sort of feedback loop all the time. We should focus on things like strategic interactions, multi-agent systems. A big one that's really important is counterfactuals. This is really hard in AI. Humans do it, though not necessarily well, but I think it's really important for us to start thinking about what is a counterfactual element here, because what a value does in a very way helps to gauge what would happen if X had occurred, right? If I hadn't done Y, would something else have occurred? And values can be a really good guide for if I had done the right thing, or did I do the right thing, or what, if they had done the right thing, et cetera. And this idea of embracing uncertainty. Okay, so we're almost done, I promise. Some examples of qualitative work. I don't expect you guys to read this. It's a highlight of some of the work, again, that Sonia has done and other folks on trying to marry the quantitative, so data analysis at scale, to capture the qualitative, right? So these sort of idea of community models. And here what we mean by that is, a mental world or mental model that we share. What are values other than this sort of model of how the world is supposed to look, right? What right looks like in some sense. So there's been this really interesting push, I don't think as much as I would like to see, but push on trying to marry the quantitative and the qualitative to give us better insights. If we can do this well, that might really inform AI, right? AI might be able to be a participant in this community rather than just sort of this tool that's either handed to it or something that sort of feeds off it in some sense. An article I wrote a while ago, I won't go into detail here, but it talks about this notion of violet teaming as a way of using community-informed values to help shape not just AI, but also AI safety, right? So, and the reason this is relevant is because if I work in biology, for example, you may say, well, why would anybody want an AI that could actually produce a highly toxic substance? If I work in chemotherapeutics, that is a gold mine to me, right? If I'm trying to develop a substance that will kill cancer cells, toxicity is actually a feature, not a bug. And so how different communities will shape what AI should be allowed to do and shouldn't be will be different, and should probably be reflected in this idea of like violet teaming. So you're not red teaming or just red teaming. How can we break this? And you're not just blue teaming and say, how do we defend it? It's actually like, what are we even trying to build by blending those two together? So you have, bad, good, and then what do we think is bad, good? And there's been a big push as well on how do you create new platforms to allow communities to give you input early on. So at the bottom there, there's on the far bottom left, there's a team called the Collective Intelligence Project that has been trying to build these tools to allow us to do this sort of quantitative work. They are most famous recently for working with Anthropic to try to go back to this like constitutional AI. So they're calling it collective constitutional AI. Let's say we're a community. How do we structure a dialogue so that we can all sort of agree on like, what are the values this model should have? And then how can Anthropic notionally train the model to reflect those values? There's a host of other things that are being involved. I would highlight though, there are people extending that logic a little too far, I think, to argue, well, can AI actually advance democratic values? This is an interesting paper. If you haven't seen it, it's from Seth Lazar at Australian National University. And he argues that it can advance instrumental values, meaning if democracy believes that like you want to aggregate lots of people's votes, it can do that. But if you look at the deeper values, the non-instrumental values of democracy, what it's really about is I need to have faith in the process, right? I should be able to audit that process, because ultimately democracy is if I lose, I have to be okay with that. If this is a process that goes through AI that's inexplicable and uninterpretable, and I lose, that erodes that value in some sense. So instrumental value, great. Non-instrumental value, not so great. And so I think it's really important to be able to think in terms of nuance here. All right, last 2 minutes. Laws for the human domain. And these are just sort of rules of thumb to keep in mind as you go forward. If you haven't heard of Amara's law, this is one that is just pretty regular. And it basically states we always overestimate the impact of a technology in the near term, and we wildly underestimate the impact of a technology in the long term. So you will run into people who think, well, AI is pretty cool, but it doesn't do X yet. I would remind you that this is the worst AI you will ever see in your life. So I think we need to be careful not to underestimate what the technology is going to be capable of doing. So this is a good thing to think about now. Arthur C. Clarke's laws and errors. So he has a couple of these laws. One law says that if a preeminent scientist says something is possible, he's almost he or she said he because it was back in the 50s. He or she is almost nearly right. And if they say something's impossible, he or she are almost definitely wrong, at least from the experience of Arthur C. Clarke. And the errors he's talking about here are the errors of imagination and the error of nerve. And it's interesting where I sit to start to figure out when people say, I don't see what there is to either get excited about or worried about, are they creating an error of imagination? Like they can't see the thing that's going to change that will really radically enhance technology? Or is it nerve? Like they can see it, but it's really kind of uncomfortable. So I would rather just ignore it or dismiss it. Goodhart's law, relevant to values, that says that people essentially try to gain measures. So if I start measuring an AI in terms of its value or its alignment, people will gain that, and it no longer becomes a good measure, right? So if we actually specify, I want aligned models for X, you will get that, but it's not clear that is a good model anymore or good metric, because people will start optimizing for that, and suddenly it's not actually measuring what you think it did. Brandolini's law is relevant here, especially in AI. Brandolini's law says, pardon my French, the energy required to dispel bullshit is 10 times the amount of energy that's required to create it in the first place. So and this is relevant in this area because there's so much hype and so much confusion. It's so easy to make that to dispel it takes 10 times as much energy. And, so don't be surprised when you see stuff come out and it just takes a while for it to be corrected. Godwin's law is worth knowing if you don't know this in the internet. It basically specifies the amount of time it takes for someone in an internet discussion to accuse someone else of being a Nazi or Hitler. So we're having debate. Godwin's law says at some point somebody's going to compare somebody to Hitler. And the reason I put that there is because it's related to my third law, Adam's third law, which states the human domain is always more complex than you think, even after accounting for Adam's third law. All right, questions? Yeah, me too. I have questions as well. But let's do this.